Hi guys, my name is Haze and I'm an artist and speed painter from Malaysia, and today will be the second video in my beginner Procreate series targeted at portrait painting. So today I have a very easy to use color palette. So while I am sketching here, I will just share with you the color palette and some tips and techniques on how to use this palette. So the first thing you want to do is to head over to this download link and download all the relevant files that you need for this tutorial. So let's talk a bit about the skin tone palette. This skin tone palette is very easy to use. It has a lot of light tones. There are a lot of skin colors here, especially on the first row, and the second tone from the top is actually white. The reddish tones are mostly for the cheeks and the lips, and then the deeper and more colorful tones right at the bottom of the row are more useful for the eyes and hair and makeup if you want to use them in that manner. Now if you look at the top right corner, there are 4 tones that are pretty gray. So we have the cool grays on top and then also the warmer grays at the bottom. So these are for neutralizing any colors that you find are too strong, or for using as hair or the whites of the eye. Now after we have downloaded the color palette, you have to download the portrait brush pack as well, because there are 3 very important brushes inside this brush pack that is very important and necessary for this tutorial to work. The 3 brushes that you will need are the airbrush, the burn, and the saturation brush from the portrait brush pack. So we will get into a tutorial on how to use this brush with the color palette right away. The sketch is now finished and we can now move on to painting with the color palette. First, we create another layer right beneath this sketch layer and we can now start to paint. So the first brush that we will be using is the painting brush, and now I am just gonna open up my color palette and guess the color of her skin tone. So I'm just taking a guess and picking the closest color that I have in this color palette and painting it with my painting brush onto her face. Now it doesn't matter if you get this color wrong or you feel that the color is not correct. The most important thing is, out of the color palette, you have to pick the closest matched to the skin tone from your reference. The next step would be to use the airbrush. The airbrush is just a soft brush that will paint the exact color that you choose onto the skin. So right now you are just going to guess another color that is correct. So I'm guessing that the shadows would be this orange here, and I'm just using the airbrush and controlling the pressure using my Apple pencil to get the tones onto the skin properly. So if you feel that your skin tone from step 1 was wrong, this is your chance to pick another color and correct it using the airbrush. You can use this brush to change the color to whichever one that you like that is available on the color palette, just as if you are using watercolor or any other traditional painting medium. Now because there are very limited colors available on this palette, you realize very quickly that you have ran out of colors that you can use. Then at this point in time, you can now proceed to step 3. For step 3, we are going to use the burn brush. So burn turns any color into ink, which means it will make the color below it darker. So if you are painting yellow on blue, it will become a dark green instead of yellow. So right now, any color that I paint on this face will make whatever I have on the current skin darker. Because the colors on this palette are all very light, you can use it and darken the skin easily without creating a big mess. So now I'm just going to use this really light yellow to darken the entire face. Now this method of painting is very intuitive, meaning you get to try and see which works and what doesn't work. So everything is by trial and error, so it's really organic and makes the process a lot more fun compared to using the grayscale method. So remember, if the color palette does not allow you to go any more darker than what you need them to be, you can always just use this burn brush and use the same color or any color that is light to burn details onto your face to get shadows and mid-tones. But you have to be careful when you are using this brush, because if your brush size is small and you overlap your brush strokes, you can see that the overlapping strokes are darker than they should be, so this will have an unsightly effect on your portrait. Now let me show you again this effect that you need to avoid. So if you are unable to control your brush strokes, you will find that you have patchy effects like this and it's looking quite messy. So later on when we are really doing the portrait for real, I'll show you how to fix this. For step 4, we are going to change to the saturation brush. So this saturation brush will change the color of anywhere you are painting, but even though you're changing the color, you will not change the value. So now I'm using pink to paint over the lips, and the lips have changed the color to pink. Now I'm going to use the same pink on the forehead, and if you look at the forehead closely, you will see that it changed to pink, but it has retained the value below, meaning that the light remains light and the darker areas remains dark. After that demonstration, we are now finally ready to paint the portrait for real. So remember, you can either paint the exact color with the airbrush, or make the color darker with burn, or change the color with saturation brush. So now we're just going to make a new layer beneath our sketch layer so that we can paint for real. Using my painting brush, I'm going to guess and pick a color that I think it represents the skin tone the closest, and I am going to paint the entire face with this color first. Then using my eraser, I am going to clean up the edges around this face so that I have a nice mask going on. Now I'm going to tap hold the screen, and then the alpha lock will come on, and I'm going to click on alpha lock to activate it. Now it's time to follow the steps that I've shown you guys previously. So I'm going to pick the airbrush and I'm going to pick another color that I think represents the shadow of the face. I make sure that my brush are big enough, and I slowly apply the color to the face carefully. As I'm applying the colors to the face, I realize that the color is not dark enough. So as this process is very organic, sometimes you will realize that, oh, once you've applied this color, you need to have it darker or lighter, or the color is different, then you can adjust accordingly. So in my case, the color isn't dark enough, so using the same color, I'm going to pick the burn brush and paint a little spot on the shadow area. Then I'm going to tap hold onto this spot to pick the color. So I'm going to switch back to my airbrush so that I can paint with this new color. To repeat again, I burned one spot onto the painting and I use the picker tool to pick the color so that I can have a new color right now that I can paint. So using this method, you can actually have an infinite amount of colors because every time you burn is a different color. So even though the color palette is very limited and have a small amount of colors, now you can have access to many other colors in different tones. Using this new color, I'm going to airbrush the entire face and create more shadows that are similar to the reference photo. Once I'm done laying down the shadows for the face, I pick the pink color for the lips and airbrush them down. Now I open up my color palette again and look at the color palette and take a guess what color I can use next to match the colors that I have right now, and I pick this orange and try to use it for the shadows as well. As I'm painting, I realize that the colors are still too light, so now I'm trying to pick a very light yellow to use it to burn onto the skin for a spot, and then I'm going to pick the color of this spot and use it to airbrush my face again. With this skin tone painted onto the face, I realized that it's much closer to the skin tone that I'm looking for. So if you are following this method, it's better to work from light to dark. So do all the light tones first before you head on to the shadows. Now I'm going to work on my darker shadows, and I'm going to pick this orange tone for my shadows first. As you're painting your new colors, you should quickly evaluate what you should do next. As I'm airbrushing this new color down on my shadows, I realized that my entire face is not yellow enough, so my next step would be to add more yellow onto the face. This time, I not only want it to go more yellow, I need it to be darker, so I'm going to pick the yellow color and I'm going to use the burn tool and burn the entire face. So now I'm being very careful on how I burn because I need to have a big brush size, or else I will have overlapping marks. I can also turn down the opacity if I don't want to show the color too much. Now you have learned all the techniques on how to manage the colors for portrait painting, so I'm just going to be very brief from now on. So next I'm just going to use the burn tool and pick another color and burn more shadows into my skin. So now I'm going to share with you another tips, and right now I just want to burn the part of the neck and not the face. So I'm using the mask tool and making sure that it's on freehand mode. Then after that I can mask just the neck, and when I paint it would just be restricted to the neck area. Now I'm just repeating the third technique of just burning with a color. After that, I felt like I need to change the colors of the eyes already, so I'm using the grey tones in the palette. At this point in time when I'm making the tutorial, I haven't added the grey tones yet, but you should be able to find it on the right hand side of the palette. So I'm going to use it and adjust the tones for my eyes using the airbrush tool. Then I need to lay the base layer for my eyebrow, and I pick the color from the eye that I already have, and I use the same color to lay down the color for my eyebrows. You can use airbrush or burn or any other painting brush, artist choice. Now I want to do the blusher for the cheeks, so I pick a pink color still using the burn brush, and I burned the pinks onto her cheeks. Not forgetting the lips, I use another more orangey tone to do the shadows for the lips. By now you should be comfortable with choosing either the airbrush tool or the burn tool, depending on what you want to achieve and what happens after you try it. So following all the methods and techniques that I've taught you guys before, I'm using different colors to build up the face and gradually get the skin tone that I want. Don't be afraid to try out all the colors using the burn tool, because you'll be amazed at what kind of colors that you can get out of this palette, and just have fun with the palette as you go. Now I still feel that this face is still too light, so I'm going to use a very light color and burn the entire face with it. To do this, I make sure that my brush size is really huge, and I try to do it in one pass so that I don't have any streaks. Once you're happy with the initial pass of colors that you have already done, you may notice that it's quite messy, so now it's time for our stage tool, which is to use the smudge tool to clean up all the tones and colors on your face. Make sure that you're using the soft blend first from the smudge brush pack, so that you have a smooth blend first before you put in any hard edges onto your portrait. Now as I smudge, I start to clean up anything that is a bit messy using any of the techniques that I've taught you guys before. I also started to erase more lines from the sketch layer so that I could see what was going on in the painting layer. You can also use the smudge tool to pull down the strokes so that you can create more brush strokes in this manner, like what I'm doing with the shadows of the eye. Because you already have all the colors laid out onto your skin, it's very easy to create hard edges by using a different brush. Usually I use a sketch brush, and I just pick a color from any part of my face that I want to do. Like for now, I'm picking a highlight to use as a highlight color on my nose. As I'm cleaning up, I'm thinking about what other details I need to add using all the techniques that I've used earlier on. With that in mind, I started adding in details while I'm cleaning using all the other techniques. And right now I'm using a slightly smaller brush because I'm working on details right now. So right now is the time to think about hard edges. When you want hard edges and sharp details, you can switch to the sketch brush. Once all the larger areas have been cleaned up, I started to work on really small details like putting on highlights. I also started to clean up all the drawing and the sketches by erasing most of the lines on the sketch layer and then redrawing them. I also like to work on one feature at a time, so right now I'm just working on the nose and trying to clean up and put in all the details that I don't have. Once I'm happy with the nose, I can now move on to another area, which is my eyebrow. I can now pick the colors from my eyes and then use them as a color for the eyebrows. The sketch brush is a great brush to use for hard edges and also for the hair on the eyebrows and lashes. And right now I'm going to move on over to my lips and redefine the shadows first. So now when I'm doing details, I like to go from shadows to light. And it's really easy to get all the colors right now because I can just pick them from the existing colors on the face. Lips are not easy to do because the tones are so subtle, sometimes you can't even see them. So it's important to really observe the lips in the photo reference and try and shade the lips so that it appears rounded and plump. Remember to finish modeling all the tones first before you put down any highlights, or else it'll be hard to go back after that. Most of the times, the tones will come to you only once you have painted something. So now that I've gone so far, I realized that it needs to be a lot darker, then I will adjust accordingly. So don't worry if you're afraid of starting out and it doesn't look good, because you can always work towards getting better. So when I'm finally happy with my lips, I can now move on to cleaning up the shape of the face. Only once I've cleaned up the jawline, then I will move forward to clean up all the areas in the chin and also, more importantly, the shadow beneath the lips. After that, I'm working on the shadows that the hair will cast on her face, so I make sure that those shadows are nice and dark. And now finally it's time for the eyes. I'm just adjusting the shadow and making them darker and more grey, because right now it's a bit orangey. So this time using a really small brush, it's still airbrush, and I'm adjusting all the tones of the shadows. Once I'm confident with the colors that I already have, I try to pick the colors, and using the sketch brush I am making all the edges harder and giving them more definitions and outlines. So I'm switching back and forth between the sketch brush and the airbrush, trying to get control on which areas have hard edges and which areas have soft edges. As you're drawing the wrinkles on her eyes, remember that whenever there's a shadow, there must always be light. So if your shadows are like mine with darkness at the bottom and light on top, so make sure that every single one is like this. The reason why we use the airbrush at the beginning of the painting is because we want to start off with soft edges, and then when we go into the details, we will only use a sketch brush to get the hard edges. It will be messy if you start with both soft and hard edge, because everything will be jumbled up together and be chaotic. So now I need to make this area darker, but I'm lazy to change brush. I'm just using the sketch brush to sketch down the lines like this, and then after that I'm gonna just use the smudge brush to smudge it so that it softens up the edges. Using the grey tones from the palette, I'm using it to quickly block down the colors for the eyes. I make sure that the iris are perfectly circled when I'm sketching it, so that they appear anatomically correct. Then I create a new layer above everything else, and I use the pupil base to use as a texture for the eyes, and I make sure that the size is about correct. Then I erase the parts that I don't want from this pupil base layer. Because the edges of this pupil base texture is a bit harsh, I'm gonna use the smudge tool to smudge it towards the center a bit. Then when I'm satisfied, I started detailing the lower eyelids with my sketch brush. After I'm done detailing, I can then soften the edges out if I want to with the soft blend brush. After that, I smudge out some lines from the tear ducts so that I can create some shadows for the lashes. And then I started to put down some reflected highlights on the tear duct because it's really hard to put them on after you paint down the lashes for the lower eyelid. Then I use my sketch brush to sketch on all the lashes. And now I repeat everything that I've done so far to the first eye onto the second eye. It's easier now because I can pick the colors from the first eye if I want to. And I can also duplicate the pupil base layer from the first eye so that I can move them to the second eye. But this time, once I'm done with the pupil base, I merge both of the pupil base layer down onto the painting layer. And now it's time to block down the color of the hair. I'm just using a normal painting brush to get colors from my palette that I think is correct and block them down onto my hair first without thinking too much. For the first time in this tutorial, we're going to use the saturation brush because the color of the hair is not very accurate. So I'm just going to pick this yellow orangey tone and use the saturation brush to change the color of the hair a little bit in a bit of the places. So you can use the saturation brush this way if the color that you want is not available. You can just pick a color that is supposed to be and change the color accordingly. Now when you're done blocking down all the colors for the hair, it's finally time to smudge them. Use the flat brush smudge tool to smudge your hair. It's very important to use this brush because it will give an effect of strands of hair, so you have to smudge it according to the directions of the hair and how it flows. Also, make sure to smudge every single part of your hair regardless whether it is soft edges or hard edges at this point, because we really want the smudge effect of the strands to come out. Then now it's finally time to erase all the sketch because everything else has been erased except for the hair. Now it's time to use the hairbrush, and using this brush you can now redraw your entire hair. Using the colors from your hair, you can just pick them from the existing colors and shade them out so that they appear to be strands of hair instead of just flat colors. I realized that I need to do her earring first because they are getting in the way of the strands. So now I'm just going to use my sketch brush and quickly block down all the tones. I don't usually give a lot of thought to this kind of details, so I kept them as simple as possible, just modeling out the tones and the light and shadows. Once I'm done, I can finally resume with my hairbrush and do all the hair strands that's covering the earrings. When you're using the hairbrush, remember to paint some strands outside the crown of her head so that they appear more natural. And right now I'm just fiddling with the colors for the background, and I insisted on using colors from this palette, so I'm just picking and see which one is nice. Then I realized that once I'm done with the hair that the face was still too light in certain areas, especially the shadows, so now I'm trying to make them darker again. Once I'm happy, I can now proceed with my hair painting again. Right now I'm choosing the strand brush, which is just one strand of hair that you can be painting at one time. So I'm using it to do all the finer details of the hair, like all the strands that's overlapping each other. finally, it's time to finish up the painting with the last details, which are the highlights and all the darker stuffs. So I'm proceeding to my lips and trying to fix it, and then I realized that I need to fix the shape. So now Liquify is a new tool in Procreate, and I can just use it to adjust the shape of the lips easily using the push tool in the Liquify mode. This allows me to push and warp the image around, especially at such a late stage when I need to mod the painting. So it's really handy to use this tool sometimes. Now her lips looks like she's smiling once more, and it looks good again. And finally, it's time to do the highlights for this painting. I'm using the freestyle highlights brush to put down the highlights at a very low opacity so that I don't overwhelm the brightness of the highlights. I can just pick any color from the color palette to use for the highlights. Since this is a brightening brush, everything will appear brighter than the painting. And of course, I can turn the opacity up if I want my highlights to be a little bit brighter. As for the highlights on the eyelids and the skin, the smaller the highlights, the more natural they look. I also apply the same concept to the lips highlights, and making sure that it is very subtle this time because I still want her lips to appear matte. Now I use the soft brightening glitter brush to apply some glitter across her face that seems to have highlights on them. Then I use the sparse shards brush to put down highlights that are a little bit more obvious. Now because the face is very smooth now, it's not very natural, so we need to texturize it so that it has some sort of a skin texture. So the easiest way to do it is to use a texturizer brush and then just pick colors and then paint over them to slightly texturize it. The technique is very simple. You just pick lighter colors and paint over dark areas, and likewise pick colors from the dark areas and paint over the light areas. After that, we can resume using the Featured Highlights Freestyle brush and put down more highlights onto the skin now that we have some texture on it. Just make sure to use a really small size brush so that they appear natural and they appear to be sparkling. To add even more texture to your face, you can use the Freckles brush, and this brush you can use any color and you will automatically create darker spots on your skin. And now for the final fix, I'm just going to burn her forehead so that it's a bit darker, so because I feel that it's still too light at the moment, and then after that we can call it done. Okay guys, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you all learned a lot from it and enjoy this color palette that I've prepared for you, and hopefully it's easy enough for you to continue using it. Thank you so much. See you next time. Bye.